Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving deep into a pretty fascinating book, I think, by Niall Ferguson.
Right.
Called The Square and the Tower: Networks, Hierarchies, and the Struggle for Global Power.
So this book, published in 2017, it really takes, I think, a unique look at history. It's not just your typical chronological retelling of events. It's more about how networks, these often invisible connections between people, have really shaped the world we live in.
I think that's a great point. And what really struck me about Ferguson's argument is this central metaphor. He uses the image of the square to represent networks. You know, that kind of dynamic, interconnected space where things are constantly in flux.
Right, it's that bustling marketplace of ideas and relationships.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that with the tower, which symbolizes those rigid hierarchies, those top-down structures of power that we often think of when we think of history, you know, kings and emperors, that sort of thing.
Yes, it's that classic image of power concentrated at the top.
And what Ferguson does so well is trace this tension between the square and the tower throughout history, showing how these two forces are constantly interacting, sometimes clashing, sometimes collaborating, but always shaping the world around us.
It's like a constant push and pull between these two forces. And it's not always a clear-cut winner.
Right.
Ferguson acknowledges that both networks and hierarchies are essential. It's more about understanding how they interact and how the balance of power shifts between them.
So it's not a simple networks good, hierarchies bad argument.
Not at all.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
One of the key insights that really resonated with me is how Ferguson highlights the often hidden power of networks.
You know, we tend to focus on the big names, the kings, the generals, the emperors. But Ferguson argues that those informal connections between people, the merchants, the artists, the revolutionaries, even the gossips, they've often been the real drivers of change.
It's like looking beneath the surface of those grand historical narratives and discovering a whole hidden world of connections and influences. One example that really stuck with me was his discussion of the Rothschild banking dynasty.
Ah, the Rothschilds, a classic example of how a network can operate within and even manipulate those seemingly impenetrable hierarchies.
Exactly.
Their financial network spanned continents, allowing them to finance wars, influence governments, and amass incredible wealth.
And they did all of this through this carefully cultivated web of relationships and information exchange.
It's like they were playing a different game altogether, one that the traditional powers didn't even fully understand.
And Ferguson doesn't just stop there. He takes us on this whirlwind tour of history, examining how networks have shaped everything from the Renaissance to the Reformation, the rise of global empires, and even the American and French Revolution.
What's fascinating is how he connects these seemingly disparate events through this lens of networks. You know, for example, he argues that the printing press, while eventually absorbed into new hierarchies, initially acted as this massive network accelerator.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah.
It's like suddenly information could spread like wildfire, challenging the church's control and giving rise to new ideas and movements.
It's almost like the early days of the internet, when information felt truly free and decentralized.
And speaking of the internet, Ferguson brings things right up to the present day, exploring how the digital age has ushered in the ultimate network.
And he poses this really thought-provoking question. Can networks like the internet really stay decentralized? Or will they always be reabsorbed into new hierarchies? He points to companies like Google and Facebook, which started as open platforms but now hold immense power.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, is that the inevitable fate of all networks?
Yeah.
But to really understand Ferguson's argument, I think we need to go back to the beginning and trace how this tension between networks and hierarchies has played out throughout history.
Okay, sounds good.
So let's start with ancient Rome, a society that's often seen as the epitome of a rigid hierarchy.
Yeah, when we think of Rome, we picture legions, emperors, and a very strict social order.
Right, but even in Rome, Ferguson shows how networks were bubbling beneath the surface.
There were merchants with their trade routes, philosophers with their schools of thought, and even gossips in the forum who could wield considerable influence.
So even in this seemingly rigid hierarchy, these informal networks were shaping public opinion, spreading information, and even challenging authority.
It's like those networks were the hidden currents shaping the flow of power in Roman society.
And this idea that networks could operate within and even challenge hierarchies continues to pop up throughout history.
Absolutely. Take the Middle Ages, for example. While feudalism was the dominant hierarchical structure, you had powerful trading networks like the Hanseatic League emerging. They created their own laws, courts, and even a navy, all without a central king or emperor.
So they were achieving complex goals and maintaining order without relying on those traditional top-down structures.
Exactly.
It's like they were weaving a whole new layer of power and influence across Europe.
And those trading networks weren't just about moving goods, they were also conduits for information, ideas, and cultural influences.
It reminds me of that passage from the book where Ferguson describes networks as the veins and arteries of a globalizing world.
Right. And that idea of networks driving globalization becomes even more pronounced as we move into the Renaissance and the age of exploration.
Think about explorers like Columbus and Magellan. Their voyages of discovery opened up new trade routes and connected continents in ways that had never been seen before.
And those voyages wouldn't have been possible without the support of networks of merchants, financiers, and even monarchs, who saw the potential for profit and power in those new connections.
It wasn't just about economic power either. The Renaissance also witnessed a flourishing of intellectual and artistic networks.
Oh, yeah. Thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli were inspired by the rediscovery of classical texts. They were tapping into this lost network of knowledge and using it to fuel a new era of creativity and innovation.
It's like those ancient networks were reawakened, breathing new life into European society.
And alongside this rediscovery of classical networks, we see another groundbreaking development that would really supercharge network power: the printing press.
Right. Suddenly, the ability to produce and share information was no longer limited to a select few.
And that truly shifted the balance of power. Ideas could now be copied, shared, and spread far and wide, creating this network of knowledge that transcended borders and challenged the traditional gatekeepers of information.
It's no coincidence that the rise of the printing press coincided with a period of tremendous social, political, and religious upheaval.
Right.
It's like the printing press gave a voice to the networks, allowing them to speak louder and reach further than ever before.
And that, in turn, forced those in the tower, the hierarchies, to adapt, to become more flexible and to find new ways to maintain control in a world where information could flow so freely.
But as we'll see, that struggle between networks and hierarchies is far from over.
Yeah, it's a constant push and pull, an ongoing dance between these two forces. And as we move further into history, we'll see how this dynamic continues to shape the world around us.
All right, well, I'm excited to keep exploring that dynamic.
Okay.
So let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back to delve deeper into the square and the tower.
So we've seen how networks were already making their presence felt, back in ancient Rome in the Middle Ages.
Right.
But as we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, things really start to heat up.
Okay.
Ferguson argues that the Enlightenment was a period where network power truly flourished. It really challenged those old hierarchies of monarchy and the church.
The Enlightenment was all about the free flow of ideas, right?
Exactly.
This questioning of authority,
Yeah.
the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, you had these incredible networks of intellectuals and scientists and reformers,
Yeah.
all gathering in salons, exchanging letters, publishing pamphlets, really pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable thought.
It's almost like the Enlightenment was one giant, interconnected network of minds, right? Challenging the established order and planting the seeds for revolutions to come.
And speaking of revolutions, Ferguson makes a compelling case that the American and French revolutions were in many ways triumphs of network power.
I mean, these weren't just top-down revolts led by a few powerful figures, were they?
No, they were fueled by networks of ordinary people, from tavern owners and printers spreading revolutionary ideas to secret societies plotting in the shadows.
It's like those revolutions were brewing in the networks of everyday life, far from the palaces and courts.
Right, and once those networks were ignited, they proved to be far more powerful than the rigid structures of the old regimes.
But even as networks were driving these profound changes, Ferguson shows how hierarchies were constantly trying to adapt and regain control.
Yeah, the 19th century saw the rise of new forms of hierarchical power, like industrial capitalism and the nation-state, which really sought to impose order on this rapidly changing world.
Right.
But even as these new hierarchies emerged, networks continued to find ways to operate within and around them. One of the most striking examples of this is the Rothschild banking dynasty, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah, they amassed incredible wealth and influence,
Yeah.
not just through their financial savvy, but also through their mastery of networking.
They really understood the power of connections.
They cultivated relationships with the powerful, gathered information from across continents, and used their network to, manipulate markets and even influence the course of wars.
The Rothschilds are a fascinating case study in how a network can operate within the very heart of hierarchical systems and kind of bend them to their will.
But their story also highlights the potential downsides of network power, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they faced accusations of being a shadowy cabal, manipulating events for their own gain.
Right. It shows how networks can be perceived as secretive and threatening by those who feel excluded from their influence.
Yeah, it's a reminder that networks, like any form of power, can be used for good or for ill.
Exactly.
And their impact depends largely on the intentions and actions of those who wield that power.
And Ferguson doesn't shy away from exploring the darker side of networks.
Yeah.
He shows how they can be used to spread misinformation, to incite violence, and to undermine democratic institutions.
He even delves into the world of secret societies, doesn't he?
He does.
Arguing that these clandestine networks have played a far more significant role in shaping history than we often realize.
It's like a hidden dimension of history, where conspiracies are hatched, secrets are whispered, and power is wielded in ways that most people never even suspect.
Right.
Ferguson shows how these groups, from the Illuminati to the Freemasons, have operated in the shadows, influencing events and challenging the established order.
It's a reminder that there's always more going on beneath the surface than meets the eye,
Absolutely.
and that networks, even when they operate in secret, can have a profound impact on the course of events.
So moving into the 20th century, we see the emergence of a new force that would dramatically reshape the relationship between networks and hierarchies.
Mass media, right? The development of radio, television, and film gave both networks and hierarchies these powerful new tools.
Yeah, hierarchies, like governments and corporations, could use mass media to broadcast their messages and shape public opinion.
But those same tools could also be used to challenge hierarchies, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the civil rights movement in the U.S., which used television to expose the horrors of segregation and to mobilize support for equality.
Or the fall of the Berlin Wall, broadcast live around the world, symbolizing the collapse of communism.
These were moments where networks, empowered by mass media, were able to challenge and even topple those seemingly unshakable hierarchies.
Right. It's like mass media, in a way, democratized the power of networks. It gave them a platform to reach wider audiences and to challenge those in control.
But of course, as with any powerful tool, it could be used for good or for ill.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've seen how propaganda and misinformation can spread just as easily through networks as positive social change.
And that brings us to the ultimate network of our time, the internet.
Right.
The internet has truly revolutionized the relationship between networks and hierarchies.
In what way?
Well, it's created a space where information flows freely, where individuals can connect across borders, and where hierarchies struggle to maintain control.
So it's no wonder that Ferguson devotes a significant portion of his book to exploring the implications of this digital revolution.
It's almost like the internet has tipped the balance of power towards networks, making them more influential than ever before.
But as Ferguson points out, it's not a simple victory for networks.
No, it's not.
I mean, the internet has also created new challenges, right?
Of course.
Like online echo chambers and the spread of fake news.
The rise of surveillance and the concentration of power in the hands of tech giants.
So it's a complex landscape, and it raises a lot of questions about the future.
Like what?
Well, can networks truly remain decentralized and democratic in the digital age?
Or will they inevitably be co-opted by new hierarchies, whether those of governments, corporations, or something else entirely?
Those are questions that Ferguson doesn't pretend to have easy answers to.
Yeah, he doesn't.
But by exploring the history of networks and hierarchies, he gives us the tools to understand these challenges and to think critically about how we can shape the future of the internet and the networked world we live in.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep those questions in mind.
Okay.
Because as Ferguson so brilliantly demonstrates, the struggle between the square and the tower is far from over.
It's a dance that continues to play out, shaping our world in profound and often unexpected ways. We've journeyed from ancient Rome to the rise of mass media.
Right.
And now we find ourselves in the 21st century, a world increasingly shaped by the internet and digital networks. So where do networks and hierarchies go from here?
Well, Ferguson doesn't offer a crystal ball or anything,
No.
but he does highlight some key trends and challenges that are shaping this ongoing dance between the square and the tower. One of the most striking, I think, is the rise of China.
Yeah. China has been incredibly adept at leveraging network power. I mean, their investments in infrastructure, technology, and global trade. It's really weaving a web of influence that's hard to ignore.
It's like they're building a new Silk Road for the 21st century.
And this poses a direct challenge to the U.S., doesn't it? which has long held the top spot in the global hierarchy.
I think so. It's almost as if we're seeing a new kind of great power competition emerge, one where networks might be the decisive factor.
It's not just happening on a global scale, though, is it? Ferguson also talks about how networks are challenging hierarchies within countries, too.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the rise of populist movements around the world.
Right.
They've used social media and online platforms to bypass traditional media, mobilize support, and challenge the established political order.
Movements like the Arab Spring, Brexit, even the election of Donald Trump, they all have this network element to them, don't they?
I think they do.
It's almost like people are finding new ways to make their voices heard, to connect with others who share their concerns, and to challenge those in power.
It's a real shift in the dynamics of power. It's like we're entering an era of networked democracy, where the relationship between citizens and their governments is being transformed by these digital tools and movements.
And it's not just in politics either, is it?
No, neither.
This is happening in the economy, too.
Exactly.
Think about the sharing economy.
Right.
With companies like Uber and Airbnb.
They've built entire business models around connecting individuals directly, cutting out those traditional intermediaries, and creating new forms of value exchange.
It's a great example of how networks are disrupting established industries and creating new opportunities.
And it raises questions about the future of work, competition, and even how wealth is distributed. It's like we're seeing the emergence of a networked economy where power is becoming more fluid and less concentrated.
So Ferguson's analysis paints a pretty complex picture of the 21st century, doesn't it?
It does.
Networks are challenging hierarchies on multiple fronts, but it's not a clear-cut victory. There are new risks to consider, too, like the spread of misinformation and the potential for these technologies to be used for surveillance and control.
The internet and these digital networks are tools. And like any tool, they can be used for good or for ill.
It's up to us to be aware of the risks, to be critical thinkers, and to actively shape these networks in a way that benefits humanity.
It's a call to action, isn't it? We can't just sit back and let these technologies dictate the future.
Right.
We need to be engaged, to be thoughtful, and to work together to create a world where networks are used to connect, empower, and build a more just and equitable future.
And that's exactly the message Ferguson leaves us with, isn't it?
It is.
He reminds us that ultimately networks are about people.
They're created by human connections, driven by human desires, and shaped by human choices.
So the future of networks is, in many ways, in our hands.
That's a good way to put it.
So there you have it. Our books and Bytes, deep dive into Niall Ferguson's The Square and the Tower.
It's given us a lot to think about, hasn't it?
It really has. From the hidden networks of ancient Rome to the digital revolutions of our time. Ferguson shows us how this interplay between networks and hierarchies has shaped the course of history and continues to define the world we live in today.
It's challenged our assumptions, expanded our understanding of power, and left us, I think, with a sense of both the immense possibilities and the potential pitfalls of this networked age.
We highly recommend picking up a copy and exploring these ideas for yourself.
Yeah, it's a good read.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing. And remember, whether you're building a network or scaling a tower, the choices you make today will shape the world of tomorrow. Happy reading.